Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus, where up here in the lofty murk, we attempt to pass Olympian judgments on all and sundry and stuff like that. But we are, as regular viewers will by now be aware, focusing on history, religion, and culture, and why they matter. And although we can't quite manage Olympian judgments, we do attempt to cast aside parties and factions and even the things that we think or believe ourselves, being prepared to kind of modify them in the light of what we actually find. So this is a place where people can't afford to be too precious about what they've thought for a long time, because we're going to be rude to you anyway. My name's Mike Yates, by the way. I always forget to say who I am.
Apparently, it's not important enough.
Yeah, quite right. Thank you.
My name is Coal Campo, and today is the 5th episode in our series that we've called Fighting Free of God. And of course, we're talking about secularization and how that has come about in society over the years. And so today's particular episode is titled A Bible Full of Errors, with a question mark, which leaves me with no less than a little bit of anxiety as we're starting out on this. But of course, it'll be illuminating as always.
Well, let's hope. We've put question marks, I think, after all our titles. And just a quick review for people who have stayed with us right through this series. We started off by looking at what is really the most important element in the secularization of Western societies, which is simply the process of sociological change. Right? Neither atheists and agnostics on the one hand, nor Christians on the other want to think that. They want to think that it was all about changes in the ideas themselves. And we are indeed spending most of the series looking at that, including today. But we spent the first episode looking at those huge changes, which in themselves will get people to think differently and shake up the kind of relationships that were so helpful to religious commitment in the past. So we've become an increasingly atomized society. So we look at that. Then we spent an episode looking at Enlightenment rationalism in the 18th century and the ideas of the philosophes, most of whom were either vehemently anti-religious or at least opposed to religion as it had been practiced up to their times, and posed a number of questions, started off a lot of big ideas, which in the 2 centuries since have come to be accepted as kind of common sense. Then we spent 2 episodes looking at 2 of the biggest political ideologies that came out of that, which also related to the changes in the way that people lived. So the disintegration of the old loyalties and the old patterns of life, leading to the emergence of modern nationalism. And then the Industrial Revolution, creating big workplaces, people working by the clock, loads of workers together on a basis of rough and ready equality, made people, some people at least, ripe for imbibing another new idea, which was socialism, and thinking of yourself in class terms. Both of these heavily secularizing. Today, we're looking at something a little more rarefied, which appears to be simply something that was happening in academia. But in fact, like loads of big ideas, it sinks down through society and affects the way that ordinary people think. And that is the rise of modern biblical criticism.
If anybody is like me and sort of sitting here thinking, why do I need to know all of this history? I always like to add how important it is and how much it impacts our daily lives to understand why things are the way they are. And so we look around and see a secular culture that was once not as secular as it is now. I think it's important to understand how we have gotten here.
Right. Well, when we're thinking about biblical criticism, what we mean is not somebody simply criticizing the Bible and saying bad things about it. What we mean is subjecting it to criticism in the academic sense and close analysis, not as had happened for hundreds and hundreds of years in order to discern its precise meaning, but trying, as it were, to see behind the text, to see if its authors were the people that they had traditionally been understood to be, whether the documents actually allowed us to date the original to the time traditionally accepted, and so on. There's so much literature been written about this, but this is a particularly good one. It's looking at the academic aspect of this story in Michael Legaspi's book, The Death of Scripture and the Rise of Biblical Studies. What he means in that title is the study of the Bible, not understood primarily as sacred text, then, for which then the urgency for us is to understand it correctly and apply it to our lives and our beliefs. But biblical studies, understood in that academic sense, kind of picking it apart, trying to find out, when it was written. Was one particular book of the Bible always simply one document, or has it been added to, or is it a compilation? All this kind of stuff.
Something that I find interesting about this is I feel like now churches want to display both sides of this. Like they want to present the Bible as an authoritative, divinely inspired text, but they also want to back up the history and the origins of it historically.
Right, and that kind of harks back to some of the discussions that we had in the series we did just before this one on apologetics, and particularly the evidentialist sort of arguments. And,
Right.
and they are a product of and a reaction against the kind of phenomena that we're going to be looking at today. Right. So, without modern biblical criticism and liberal theology, maybe no Josh McDowell, right? Because what he's doing is bouncing off that and saying, no, 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 we can argue this very differently. Right? So today we're taking that kind of step back and looking at this. Well, what do we mean by modernist liberalism? Certainly, when I was a young Christian, I would hear people in churches tut-tutting about what they called modernism. And that seemed to me to be extremely unattractive. Surely modern equals good. But what they meant by it was the kind of liberal critiques of the Bible that had come out of modern methodologies, which they opposed. And once I understood what they were talking about, I kind of agreed with them. And then years later, I found out really what we were talking about here substantively, because I don't believe they really did or I did. It was just a way of talking. Okay, what kind of ideas in general, and all of these podcasts are just looking at the subject in general, come out of this? Well, disbelief in the deity of Christ and of the virgin birth. So, a number of discussions, even before the 19th century, to be honest, but certainly in the 19th century, take it that the miraculous doesn't happen and God can't become a human being, and a virgin birth would be a miracle, and therefore that can't have happened, and so on. And maybe the text doesn't mean that anyway, and I have heard that argument. You can make that. There's a lot of skepticism about miracles, but as we saw in an earlier episode, this the second episode in this series, David Hume in the previous century had argued that these were, did he say that they were impossible? He strongly implied that they were impossible, yes. Because the modernist mindset is slipping into the kind of discussion that says everything happens in observable form. We can analyze anything.
Right.
And that in itself tends to rule out the miraculous. Everything happens in what, say, Francis Schaeffer would have called a closed system, the world being a kind of closed system, which is itself implicitly atheistic, of course. Dismissing the traditional authorship and the date of many of the books of the Bible. So the books, particularly in the Old Testament, were written far later than they were traditionally believed to have been, and written by other hands. So, for example, it had been generally believed that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, were written by Moses, which is a bit difficult because his death is described.
He's having an out of body experience, of course.
That's probably what it is, yeah. You go into Bibles in, well, I assume a number of languages. I'm not familiar with that many, but if you look at a German Bible, And the first 5 books are not called Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They're called the first book of Moses, second book of Moses, and so on, the books of Moses, right? And that just indicates that kind of traditional belief. And attempts were made to postulate sources, that is, earlier written documents for the Gospels, which there may well have been, and that discussion is still continuing today, particularly the source Q and exactly how far the synoptic Gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were dependent upon it, or how much they were dependent on one another, this kind of thing. And these were discussions that hadn't really happened substantively before. But also, many of these academics dismissed the factual historicity of biblical statements on the basis of current archaeological findings. So it seemed from something that had recently been dug up in the Middle East somewhere that maybe statements in the Old Testament weren't actually historically correct, or dismissing them on linguistic or textual grounds. I mean, there's a problem with this, and we've mentioned it already in the series on apologetics, that the current state of archaeology, just like any other discipline, or linguistic studies, textual studies, is constantly in flux. And what will seem to be assured in one period might look very different even 50 years later, never mind 100 or 150 years later. A point I'd want to make here, by the way, and I did think about sneaking in a section on this, but I realised in time that there just wasn't going to be room for it. I'll just mention it very briefly now, is that modern Westerners don't know how to read ancient documents. That is quite easy to demonstrate. They're applying the kind of criteria to it that nobody would have made before modern times and only in the West. And therefore, it's not too surprising that literalist ways of talking are insisted upon by people we're not going to discuss in this episode, but we will in a future series, fundamentalists, but also by liberal debunkers alike. They both want to insist that that's how documents must surely be intended. And so the former want to insist that they must be understood historically and that the history is therefore correct. And the latter want to insist that they must be understood historically, and they think the history is incorrect, and therefore the document is not what it claims to be. And I want to say that both of them have a misunderstanding about the nature of these texts. So, but to give another example of this direction of thought, comparing biblical accounts of, for example, Noah's flood, with similar stories in other religions or traditions, and concluding that the biblical material was just a borrowed or altered story.
Yeah, this one always makes me laugh, because why shouldn't it be the Genesis account that other stories are borrowing from?
Well, that could be, yes. I'm sure that people who are experts on this, and I am not an expert on this, so this is why these things are about history, religion, and culture, and they're not close studies of biblical texts, right? Would come in and want to debate with us exactly which documents came earlier and so on. But it's certainly a point worthy of consideration. Okay, well, let's look at this man who's perhaps the most important. He's often called the father of modern liberal theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher. He was a pastor's son from Breslau in Prussia, which is today Wrocław in Poland, has been since the Second World War. He was from the Reformed Church and was himself a pastor there. Even at a very young age, he was 18 years old and a student in the first year at Halle University. His father, who was also a pastor, had been unwilling to send him there because he felt that Halle was already becoming less than orthodox. And as a first year student, he wrote a distressing letter to his father saying that he no longer believed in the deity of Christ, that Jesus was God, or in the atonement. And in fact, even though he was so young, he never actually retreated from those views. That's what he stuck with for the rest of his life. He was hugely influenced by Romanticism and supported liberalism in politics. So he's a man of his age, right? He's absolutely going along with the ideas current in his milieu, in society, and in his time period, and sought a reconciliation of Christianity with Enlightenment ideas. Now already here, I think there's a problem, not just with him, but with lots of people whose mind moves in this kind of direction. They're desperate to debunk traditional ideas or the Bible, but are totally uncritical about the prevailing opinions and directions of thought of their own time. And I would want to contend that, if anything, well, either be critical of both, or if anything, be critical of the opinions of your own time, because they haven't been tested.
Yeah, we don't know anybody who still maintains this lens.
Well, no, nobody at all, of course. There's a fixation, even amongst people who would pass as fairly orthodox, little o orthodox, nevertheless to be as relevant and as groovy as possible, and nothing can be more passé than that, frankly. Yeah. Okay, so his first book on religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers, was pitched as an appeal to the already rather secularized, educated classes of Prussia. Now, actually, I think this is kind of admirable, because loads of people that follow this direction of thought and continue to this day, even though what now might be called liberal theology has changed an awful lot, most of their public appeals is actually directed against Orthodox Christians. He was still, bless him, directing his fire outwards. So that's got to count for something at least. Well, he was professor at Halle for a few years, and after that moved on to Berlin, where he spent basically the rest of his career. His theology emphasizes feeling over dogma. Now, quick reality check here. Dogma by our time, not in his, dogma by our time has become a dirty word because we are so relativistic, and dogma refers to a fixed point of belief, right? Whereas dogma is a neutral word. A dogma might be good or it might be bad, right? As it was still in his time. But he's starting the move in the direction of emphasizing feeling, which of course is with us in full force still. Religion, he thinks, is the outcome neither of the fear of death nor of the fear of God. It answers a deep need in man. It's neither a metaphysic nor a morality. Metaphysics is the discussion about the nature of the universe, whether there's a God or gods or heaven, whether matter is all there is, or there are other things. All of that comes under the heading of metaphysics. It's not a metaphysic nor a morality, but above all and essentially an intuition and a feeling. Dogmas are not, properly speaking, part of religion. Rather, it is that they are derived from it. So what he's saying is that we start with feeling, that produces religion, and then the religion produces the dogmas. Religion is the miracle of direct relationship with the, and you think he's going to say at least the divine. He says the infinite. Boy. And dogmas are the reflection of this miracle. Similarly, belief in God and in personal immortality are not necessarily a part of religion.
Well, here he has a point, right? Because Buddhists don't necessarily believe in God.
Right, they don't. And yet that counts as a religion. Okay, one can conceive of a religion without God, and it would be pure contemplation of the universe. The desire for personal immortality seems rather to show a lack of religion, since religion assumes a desire to lose oneself in the infinite rather than to preserve one's own finite self. Is he being dogmatic there? I'm not quite sure that that's necessarily what religion is. But anyway, We're simply trying to illustrate the cast of his mind.
Yes.
Right. By the 1820s, then, the pietist bastion where he'd studied of Halle University is already greatly liberalized. And this is just an excerpt from a speech by Professor August Toluck, a German professor who's in Britain speaking to the London Missionary Alliance in 1825, warning them about the terrible things that are happening in his homeland. That Prussian university, which is attended by the greatest part of the theological students, the University of Halle, from where Professor Franke once spread forth the seeds of the true religion throughout Germany. Quick aside here, this is August Hermann Franke, who had been 100 years before an incredible hero of pietism. Pietism is like proto-evangelicalism. If you can imagine evangelicalism that's less shouty and preachy, a little bit quieter.
That's hard to imagine.
Yeah. You've got pietism, right? Huge movement particularly in Germanic Europe, in both the Lutheran and the Reformed churches. He'd not just been a professor of theology at Halle, but he'd founded orphanages, he'd started schools and charities of all kinds. So what Torluck's doing is pointing back and saying, look, this wonderful man, everybody admires him, right, from 100 years ago. This place, Halle, of all places, is completely gone to the dogs. It's now the seat of unbelief. In this university, there are between 500 and 600 theology students, and several of the professors, year in and year out, proceed to teach that Christ was a man just like the rest of mankind. Certainly in some ways accompanied by the divine providence, but in other ways also by fanatical ideas. If that's the teaching which is imparted to future shepherds of the flock, because these students are going to go on and become ministers, how can the flock be guided on the way of truth? So he's warning the Brits, look what's happening in Germany. Now we'll see in a few minutes that it comes to Britain anyway, and what happens a generation after that is that loads of Americans say, look what happened in Germany, look what's happened to Britain, now it's coming here, because it does, certainly by the late 19th, early 20th century. Well, another very influential book that appears around this time, in 1835 actually, is David Strauss's Life of Jesus, which basically tries to strip all of the miracles out of the gospel accounts and say, well, these are later insertions simply reflecting the developing beliefs of Christians about Jesus. Now, although put as starkly as that's not generally accepted today, that direction of thought is still there with some people. But again, it comes from the same kind of Enlightenment rationalism. Well, if there's an account of a miracle, it can't be true. So we have to account for the account some other way.
Right.
Well, let's scroll on a few decades and get to the 1870s. And here we are with W.R. Smith in the Free Church College in Aberdeen, in Scotland. And he's defending historicism, which is, in this context, insisting that everything is simply a historical product, including the text of the Bible, and is to be understood accordingly. Modern theological science.
Hold on.
Right.
I didn't know theology was a science.
No, neither did I. I suppose in the strict Germanic sense of a Wissenschaft, a field of knowledge, which is where our word science comes from, the Latin scire, to know, right? So it's just a form of knowledge. But really, already science had the sense that we now have for it, of being related to, biology, chemistry, physics, these kinds of things. And it had tremendously high status and reputation. And other disciplines, what we now call the social sciences or the arts, wanted that status and often described themselves as a science. Now we'll find people, Smith is of very liberal theological opinions, but we can find people, and we will do in later series, who are either fundamentalists or proto-fundamentalists who use the same kind of language to describe their own method, right? Because they want that kind of kudos.
Right.
Modern theological science is altogether right when it insists that the Bible must be studied by the same principle of historical continuity which is employed in the examination of other records of the past. The evolution of God's dealings with man cannot be understood except by looking at the human side of the process. Now, there's another key word he's thrown out there, evolution. Because 19 years before, in 1859, Darwin had produced his Origin of Species, and evolution was becoming like a trope, a lens through which you saw everything. And people who are thinking like Smith wants to say that God deals with people in different ways. Well, that's there in the idea of two different covenants, I suppose. But that God's dealings evolve, right, by some internal process. You know? Uh, God gets nicer in the New Testament than in the Old Testament when goofy things happen. I mean, I remember a version of that way of talking from my RE religious education teacher when I was in school. Right, the God was getting nicer with the passing of time.
Yet the predestination people want to say that God never changes his mind. So
Yeah, well, that's falling off the other end of the other end of the pier, I think. But there we are. Yes, the Bible actually says that God changes his mind. But anyway, we're not going to get involved in that tussle here, right? So the evolution of God's dealings with man cannot be understood except by looking at the human side of the process. The only idea of moral and spiritual evolution can morality and spirituality evolve? Possible to us is that of evolution in accordance with psychological laws. So all of this kind of newfangled, either scientific or quasi or perhaps faux scientific jargon is coming into play here.
yeah, and a lot of modernist influence, it sounds like, as well.
Well, yeah, but
Or
in a sense that is the same thing. That's another way of talking about the same thing. Yes, yes, yes.
right.
Well, let's cross the Atlantic here. We're going to be crisscrossing the Atlantic a couple of times, and we'll come to this man, C.A. Briggs, very important figure in the US. He was professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York from 1874 onwards. He was excommunicated by the Presbyterian Church in 1893. There had been a previous attempt to excommunicate him, and he tried as hard as possible to be excommunicated. And it failed the first time around because his antagonists proved too accommodating, but he managed it in the end, and then went off and got ordained as an Episcopalian a few years later. Well, these are the accusations that were made against Briggs at the first attempt. He was accused of teaching that reason and the church, not the Bible only, are both sources of divine authority. Well, call me a liberal if you like, but I think that's probably fair enough. But the next bit isn't, and that they can savingly enlighten people.
Oof.
Yeah. Errors may have existed in the original biblical texts. Actually, I'm not sure how one could ever ascertain such a thing. A lot of churches and colleges and other institutions today will talk about the Bible having been inerrant in the original manuscripts, which is opening the door to people who are not strictly fundamentalists because they can just laugh and say, well, we haven't got the original manuscripts, have we? And we never have.
Right.
Right? So it's kind of like a meaningless statement. And quite often the people who are formulating those know exactly what they are saying. They're wanting to satisfy the inerrantist groups amongst them, whilst nevertheless leaving the door open to people who are not really like that, because there's like your get out of jail free card.
Yeah.
And that's true with so many churches. I'm someone who, whenever I encounter a new college or a new church group that I haven't come across before, I'll go to their website, and the first thing I'll do is drill down into their statement of faith and look closely at the things that they say, but also at the things that they make a point of not saying. Always very illuminating. Okay, so many biblical prophecies have been proven to be wrong. Moses was not the author of the Pentateuch. It's entirely possible. Nor Isaiah of the second half of the book of Isaiah. This is above my pay grade, but I do know that for a long time there have been fierce disputes about whether there was one Isaiah or two, or maybe even more, and the dating of it and so on. So that was a fairly newly current issue then. But also the hope of redemption is offered also to the dead beyond the grave. So even if people die in a state of impenitence, we needn't despair, because maybe they'll hear the gospel after they're dead. So it's moving towards the most inclusive, or perhaps just liberal, meaning of the word universalism. So like everybody's saved. It's moving in that kind of direction.
And since you brought that up, do you think that was the intentions of these people to make the church more inclusive?
You'll have to forgive me for quibbling with your question. This is a point that's worth pursuing. Inclusive has only fairly recently, well, at least during my lifetime, taken on the kind of unquestioned good sense that it now has, right? And exclusive is almost automatically bad unless you're selling exclusive products, and then you can get away with it. But anything else, it's automatically bad, right? Let's remind ourselves that these people have left behind, but not as far away from it as we are, a period when the church was extremely inclusive. It included everybody, right?
Right.
So he wouldn't have resorted to the word inclusive. He's very happy with, as you and I and everybody today would be happy with, a situation in which people can include themselves in whatever they want or exclude themselves. But then that in turn means that churches have a perfect right to say, well, we're going to be exclusive to people who think what we think. But nevertheless, he's inherited the Enlightenment optimism about humanity. So that's going to be one of the things that's going to be pushing him in that direction. And of course, even today, that's very hard for people to entirely, brush out of their hair, really, that kind of Enlightenment optimism.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's have a look at what he has to say about history and science versus tradition. Now, in a way, he's picking up on a long-standing Protestant idea that as Protestants we stand against tradition on the basis of where reason leads us on the basis of the Bible. Except, of course, he's taking this a lot further in saying, well, yes, we want to see where the Bible leads us, but we're critiquing the Bible too. So maybe the Bible doesn't lead us to traditional Christian doctrines. It simply won't do, he says, to antagonize the critical theories of the Bible with traditional theories, for the critic appeals to history against tradition, to an array of facts against so-called inferences. History, facts, and truth are all divine products and must prevail. So basically, history, facts, and truth are the products of the new sciences and studies and academic disciplines. And he's saying, in the end, they're bound to win against traditional beliefs and theories, even about the Bible. And in a private letter of 10 years later, he says, we stand on the heights of the last of the great movements of Christendom. It must be evident to every thinking man that the traditional dogma has been battling against philosophy and science, history, and every form of human learning. There can be little doubt but that the traditional dogma is doomed. Shall it be allowed to drag down into perdition with it, the Bible and the creeds. So he thinks that you can still hang on to the creeds and whatever ragged form is left of the Bible by the time that he's done with it, they'll still be okay even when all these other disciplines have done their worst. But he is helping them to do their worst. He also is informed by an awful lot of Enlightenment optimism. He thinks that all of this is leading to a better world. And of course, the secularists in his own day thought that the rising tide of secularism was leading to a better world. The 20th century certainly proved that wrong. And that it would lead to churches coming together because, having abandoned most of their dogmas, they no longer had anything to squabble about, and world redemption. Well, these kinds of people actually capture the denominational seminaries. In the late 19th century, many theological colleges in the US and Britain are racked by disputes between liberals, modernists, and traditionalists. And for the most part, the traditionalists won the first round and slapped the rising tide of liberals down. But there was a second wave of such disputes a few years later, and it was the liberals who triumphed, took over the seminaries, and a lot of theological conservatives left or were driven out, often setting up new institutions of their own. So viewers who are familiar with Bible colleges and those kinds of institutions, those were set up generally in the early-ish decades, particularly 1920s, 1930s of the 20th century, by people who had either been kicked out of the theological colleges and seminaries or felt that they were a lost cause.
So at this point, the liberals are gaining some ground.
Oh yes, they are taking over. And so there's lots of splits in denominations over these kinds of issues and in mission boards and so on. And certainly the liberals at the time must have felt that history was on their side, except that, of course, in the long run, it wasn't, because they simply were unable to reproduce themselves. And so let's look at the secularizing effects of that, because lots of people listening to this podcast up to this point might think, well, this is all very well, but it's like an academic game. How does this actually secularize the West? Well, let's think this through. So the new ideas affect first the theological colleges that trained clergy. Only a few of those clergy then went on to preach these new ideas from the pulpit. But some did. But most of them were reticent to preach against doctrines central to Orthodox faith because they thought they'd lose their congregations or maybe they'd be kicked out. But privately, they no longer believed in them. So they lived tortured lives. But that led to a greatly watered down Christianity in those denominations over time. And so to the lack of any compelling reason to go to church. Now, this, in a sense, although we're in a very different climate now, the same kind of thing is true today in your church or mine. If the leadership goes silent on central Christian doctrines, or maybe just some particular one, for years, as something that tacitly we're all agreed on, but everyone's afraid to touch, what will happen over 20, 30, 40 years is we're not all agreed on it at all, and it'll fall. Right? And this is what's happening in congregation after congregation, particularly in Britain and America, but in other countries as well.
Right. Even if the congregation doesn't realize that that's what's happening, like even if they don't notice that there's certain issues that aren't being talked about.
Right. Unfortunately, most people are not very reflective, but in the end, they will get it because they'll turn around one day and say, well, I don't think this has been talked about for years and years, and maybe it's not essential. Or maybe their son or their daughter will say, well, I don't believe that. Oh, I do, but we haven't discussed it in decades, and then it's gone. Now, I would maintain, actually, on the basis of this, that churches that don't want this to happen to them, they need, as it were, to keep patrolling the boundaries and to expounding on a fairly regular basis central orthodoxies. Most churches just, I'm afraid, preach spiritual sounding fluff most weeks. It's absolutely broad. This is not something I think, this is something I know. How do I know this? Because all of these 18-year-olds show up in college having been brought up in good and godly Christian homes, and they don't know one end of the Bible from the other, and they don't have an orthodoxy, they have an orthopathy, right? So yeah, this is still going on.
Yes.
So yeah, but this is going on in a rather different milieu back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that leads to an inability to hang on to their children in the next generation. And furthermore, the attempts to restate Christianity in increasingly rationalist terms, like this, make the faith seem lame or unpersuasive. It's easier simply to accept rationalism, right? We're not going to take seriously the clergyman who comes to us propounding some version of the faith that's basically just what we already think with a few spiritual pious thoughts attached. We'll just shrug it off. Well, notice to our viewers, we are not going to be looking in detail at the conservative reaction to all of this. We're just going to outline it in general terms. We're going to be looking at it in detail in future series in a few weeks' time. But we'll note for now, at least, that there is conservative reaction. Let's start with this man, one of the most famous preachers of the 19th century, and very frequently quoted in sermons today, Charles Haddon Spurgeon. A remarkable man, as you'll see in a moment, from the way that he talks. Well, here's Vanity Fair magazine making fun of him, but they made fun of everybody, so cut them some slack. Cartoon. He was a very important Baptist leader and was appalled at the erosion of orthodoxy amongst the English Baptists, whom we tend to think of as, pretty firm line. But he saw them being seriously eroded. And he called this the downward grade or the downgrade. Our solemn conviction is that things are much worse in many churches than they seem to be and are rapidly tending downward. Read those newspapers which represent the so-called broad school of dissent. Now, for non-Brits, maybe even for some Brits these days, dissent, non-conformist churches, churches that were not part of the Church of England, but were something else, Congregationalist, Methodist, Baptist, right? This kind of thing. And ask yourself, how much further could they go? What doctrine remains to be abandoned? What other truth to be the object of contempt? A new religion has been initiated, which is no more Christianity than chalk is cheese. And this religion, being destitute of moral honesty, palms itself off as the old faith with slight improvements. And on this plea, usurps pulpits, which were erected for gospel preaching. The atonement is skirted, we might say. The inspiration of Scripture is derided. The Holy Spirit is degraded into an influence, rather than the third person of the Trinity. Right? The punishment of sin is turned into fiction, and the resurrection into a myth. And yet these enemies of our faith expect us to call them brethren and maintain a confederacy with them.
Some of these things that he mentions specifically, I feel like are some issues that we're still seeing today, like things that churches are missing out on, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't entirely gone away. I would want to draw not a very sharp distinction, but certainly a distinction between this modernist liberalism and what we have now, which is postmodern liberalism, right? Modernist liberalism typically said that traditional orthodoxy is not true, or that the Bible is unreliable, whereas postmodern liberalism tends to say you can interpret this text any way you want, and I'm going to interpret it in the way that I want. We're not under any obligation to give a traditional meaning to this text. And even if nobody has taught the meaning of this text as being like this at any point in the past until today, well, I'm going to tell you what I think it really means. That kind of
Yes.
approach, right? And that's what we've got now. So what he was suggesting, and we'll see it again in a moment, is that Baptists who were Orthodox should break away from the Baptist Union. And in fact, he did break away from the Baptist Union and was aghast to find, because he was such a hero in the eyes of so many people, particularly amongst English Baptists, was aghast to find that almost nobody followed him in breaking away from the Baptist Union. And he died a few years later, in some ways a broken man because of this.
Which is interesting since he's so popular now.
Right, yeah, and easily the biggest Baptist training college in Britain is named after him, Spurgeon's College in South London. Yeah. At the back of doctrinal falsehood comes a natural decline of spiritual life. Avowed atheists aren't a tenth as dangerous as those preachers who scatter doubt and stab at faith. Germany was made unbelieving by her preachers, and England is following in her track. Right? That's a point we made a few minutes ago, and like I say, a few years after this, American preachers will be saying the same thing about Germany, and then England, and now us, and it was indeed so. Attendance at places of worship is declining. Have these advanced thinkers filled their own chapels? In meeting houses holding 1,500, places once packed to the ceiling with ardent hearers, how small are the numbers now? The places which the gospel filled, the new nonsense has emptied and will keep empty. Now he's putting his finger on the great weakness, the practical weakness of liberalism, that it can't hold on to its own constituency for more than a generation or perhaps a generation and a half, and it certainly can't convert anybody. Now, I am, as you know, about 900 years old and have, in that endless span of life, met a dizzying array of different kinds of people with different kinds of beliefs and different kinds of Christians and pseudo-Christians and all the rest of it. There is one kind of person I have never met, and that is someone who's been converted to, let us call it, liberal Christianity from atheism
Right.
or agnosticism or Islam or another religion. Never met them.
Hmm.
All of those people have come from more orthodox forms of the faith. This is a point we'll return to. Right?
Yeah.
So it's parasitic in that sense, and Spurgeon is putting his finger on that right here. It now becomes, he says, a serious question how far those who abide by the faith once delivered to the saints, the biblical phrase, should fraternize with those who've turned aside to another gospel. How far are we justified in being in confederacy with those who are departing from the truth? So he's preparing the ground for breaking away. As I say, it doesn't end well for him. Well, okay, so that's 2 crossings of the Atlantic by my count. Here comes number 3. We're going to end up back in America again. And we'll finish with a couple of these, not quite finished, certainly on the Protestant side of things, we'll finish with a couple of these very, very reformed guys. Now, B.B. Warfield remains a hero today for extremely reformed types. Right? He's professor of reformed theology at Princeton. He wrote on a number of polemical subjects, some of which he would have done better to have left alone. But we're focusing here on what he has to say about the nature of biblical criticism. And he wants to say biblical criticism is just fine. But most of the biblical critics are wrong. That they have a perfect right to criticism. We hear a great deal nowadays of the right of criticism, spoken with a certain air of conscious heroism, as if criticism, with a big C, doubtless because it's higher criticism, were being dreadfully oppressed by somebody. But we know no one who denies the right of criticism. Everybody uses it, and everybody honours it. It's the instrument by which we test truth. I'm not sure this is really true nowadays, but okay. It was when he's writing. So far from the Bible being less subject to criticism than other books, we're bound to submit its unique claims to a criticism of unique rigour. Criticism is the mode of procedure by which we assure ourselves that it is what it claims to be. Who will cast his soul's eternal welfare on an uncriticised way of life? It's because we believe in criticism and practice it with unflinching severity that we reject the revelations of Muhammad, the Book of Mormon, and accept and rest upon the religion of Israel according to Moses and the prophets, and the gospel of Christ according to the evangelists and the apostles. Deny the validity of criticism of the Bible? Nobody dreams of it. At our soul's peril, we dare not. In proportion as we are awake to what the Bible means for man, will we search the scriptures to see whether these things are so. Whence then arises the complaint, we would say, which we hear about us? From the ineradicable tendency of man to confound the right of criticism with the rightness of his own criticism.
So he's saying that just because you have a right to criticize doesn't mean you get to be correct.
Right, you can criticise, but maybe you can criticise and be wrong. Right. Criticism, we're justly told, is only a method. So is mathematics only a method. So you can do maths, but that doesn't stop you coming to the wrong answer. That's what he's saying. This does not vindicate the correctness of every mathematical calculation by every hand. Neither figures nor criticism will lie, but the men that use them may manage to reach very false conclusions. What's the present situation with regard to the criticism of the Old Testament? On the credit of a method of criticism which is discredited wherever it can be tested, we're being asked to believe that a large number of the books in the Old Testament are not the product of their apparent ages or their reputed authors, but the stratified deposits of the sea of time. On this evidence, at least, we respectfully decline. Now, a quick insertion here. Scholarship has obviously moved on since Warfield was writing. Some of the criticisms current in his own time are still with us, but the general tide, even of academic opinion, has moved back on a number of subjects in favour of the Old Testament. Right, but still these things are discussed. But the situation doesn't look as dreadful as it did from an Orthodox point of view at the time that Warfield was writing. The refusal of the Church to remain responsible before the world for their teaching is no blow at the right of criticism. It is, on the one hand, only the assertion by the Church of her right to teach only what she believes, without infringing in the least upon the right of others to teach what they please on their own responsibility and in their own names. Or is the critic only to be free and the Church bound? What he's saying here is, look, these people who are making these kinds of arguments, they still want to get salaries from church seminaries or to be pastors and be paid by the church whose doctrines they are attacking. It's absolutely fine if they want to teach something completely different, but go and paddle your own canoe or set up shop on your own account and see what following you get. And of course, even though we're now, as I would say, in an age of postmodern liberalism, this issue is still with us. And we see it, well, we could name names, but we won't. But it's still going on. Right? Let him exercise freely his right to criticise, and let the Church also be free to test the truth of his theories of the Scriptures and to act accordingly.
So he's not saying that nobody can disagree with him.
No, he's not saying that. Certainly not. No. Having looked at Warfield, let's switch now to look at the situation in the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was much more resistant to this. Certainly until the 1960s, they didn't allow this kind of stuff to be taught at all. Well, let's have a look at a quip from the extremely humorous and very popular writer G.K. Chesterton, just briefly, and then at a much more serious, indeed Catholic polemical argument from someone else. So Chesterton, he's an author, philosopher. Of course, he writes the Father Brown detective stories, and an extremely funny man. He quipped in 1926, "I grew up in a world in which Protestants, who had just proved that Rome did not believe the Bible, were excitedly discovering that they didn't believe the Bible themselves, which is a pretty good poke. But let's come to someone who's rather better at being serious here, and this is F.J. Ripley. Now, he's very little known nowadays. He was an English Catholic priest, but he spent a lot of time in America, and the situation he's about to describe to us is the American situation, and it's an anti-Protestant polemic. He's writing this in 1951, so before the Second Vatican Council. So when pretty hard-boiled versions of Catholicism still reign supreme, and Protestant Catholic relations are generally not good. They're about to be transformed, but this is before that happens. So the Catholic Church is today the greatest defender of the Bible, not only against unbelieving rationalists, but against Protestant attacks. Professor G.H. Betts, a Protestant university professor, sent out 56 questions on religion to 1,309 Protestant ministers and to 5 Protestant theological seminaries. In their replies, 2% of the Lutheran ministers, 38% of the Baptist ministers, 60% of the Episcopal ministers, 65% of the Methodist ministers, 56% of the Presbyterian ministers, 83% of the congregational ministers, and 92% of the students of the seminaries denied or doubted the divine inspiration of the Bible.
Oof.
Well, and of course, these people are going to, the students are going to go on and become the next generation of pastors. The Catholic Church has always regarded the Bible as the inspired word of God, and she demands that all her children accept the Bible as such. Yes, Father Ripley, but the Catholic Church has been very restrained in encouraging, well, that is, it hasn't really encouraged people to read it because it's afraid that they might come to conclusions of their own. There must be some external authority to decide which books are part of the inspired Bible and which not. The Bible itself doesn't say. It's only through the infallible authority of the Catholic Church that men today know for certain the contents of the Bible. The Church provides a correct and complete version of the Scriptures and forbids Catholics to use the Protestant Bible. Most important is the fact that the Scriptures needed a guarantee of authenticity. The Church alone could give that guarantee. Without the Church, it cannot exist. It's only through the Catholic Church that Protestants know what the Bible contains. In the early years of Christianity, there were many, many books claiming to give account of Christ's life and miracles. Who's to decide which were inspired and which not? Obviously, only an infallible church could do this. Well, now, that's a very strong sounding argument, but it isn't anything like as strong as it sounds, right? The answer, I'm afraid, is a bit long and convoluted. It's through rejecting tradition and leaving every man to interpret the Bible for himself that Protestantism has resulted in such a multiplicity of contradictory sects. Now, that's a Catholic argument that goes right back to the time of the Reformation itself. And he wants to say that the result in the present day, in 1951, is that the Bible is less respected, less used, and less understood in the world than ever before. Which, as I say, is a little bit naughty because the Catholic Church had not been very keen on lay people reading the Bible until modern times, when it became impossible really to stop them.
But he's not entirely wrong about that either.
No, he's not. There's certainly a lot to be said for what he says, but it's not as overwhelming as that presentation of the case makes it sound, not by any means. No. Okay, well, let's conclude then by pointing out liberal theology's fatal weakness. It sought to restate Christianity in terms acceptable to an ever more rationalist intellectual climate. And so it always appeared as a movement in retreat or apologizing for itself.
We're saying that a Christianity of this sort will always be changing, not just its form, which would be fine, but its essential content.
Yes. They would reply to you and me that, well, Christianity has always been changing over 2,000 years. But yeah, our response would be, okay, but not the core content, generally just the form, which is fine, yes. Here's something that's a point distinctive to me, but I still think it's an important one. All of its intellectual artillery, so to speak, was trained upon orthodoxy, from whom it sought its converts. That was its only source of converts, people coming from more orthodox forms of the faith. It appeared to have little distinctive to say to secular society that couldn't be equally well, or perhaps better stated, in purely secular terms. And I'm afraid, but you already know that I'm a very bad man. When I sense that someone is starting to slip away, as it were, notice the direction in which all their intellectual artillery is pointed. And everybody wants to make criticism of the church they're in, or of churches generally, or something like that. But if that has become somebody's central obsession, and they don't really have anything to say to the outer world that is distinctively Christian, then, to borrow a term from some films of recent years, they have gone over to the dark side.
Oh.
It's a good way to measure it. You can see it going on, right? And a lot of people who get fed up with this, that, or the other thing about churches need to give themselves a health check along precisely those lines. So it was thus parasitic upon the very bodies, orthodox churches and institutions, which it sought to undermine, and upon defectors from whom it depended for adherence, which is why, of course, modernist liberalism has largely collapsed, right? Because it simply runs out of people. And what we've got now is a postmodern form of liberalism, and the same thing's going to happen.
Yeah, I thought this episode was so interesting because I had always sort of assumed, I guess, that the church trying to reconcile itself with, you know, the politics or whatever is going on around us. I just assumed that was a new phenomenon. Well, come to find out, it's been going on for a while.
well, certainly on the political stuff, yeah, that's been going on for a while as well, yes. But people want to be liked in the societies that they live in, and that includes Christians want to be liked, except that they're in a very secular society. So they want to feel that they're going along with the central currents of the world that they live in, which is a decent enough instinct to have, but it constantly misleads them to try and restate the faith in terms that are going to please people who are basically inimical to the faith. So that does remain a problem. But just as postmodern liberalism is repeating the general trajectory of modernist liberalism, so orthodox or conservative reactions to it are repeating what happened in the early 20th century, I would suggest. But anyway, we can't pursue that one for now. Okay, so I hope that everybody's now got their minds around at least the general outlines of this subject. And general outlines is all we're doing in any of these podcasts. So this is one more thing that has the effect of secularizing society and basically leaving presentations of Orthodox Christianity look like very much minority affairs in the modern world. And that's a reality, of course, that is still with us. And next week, we're going to be looking at that old chestnut, the clash between science and religion. And without bowing out of this series and then getting into something else. So thank you for staying with us, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.
And if you thought of anybody in particular while you were listening to this episode that you know, make sure that you send this episode to them so that they can also be thoroughly annoyed as much as you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you very much, and bye-bye, everybody.